What's up, people? My name's Dave. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Garb Car Garage. Today, we're going to take this scrapyard hood I've got from a Subaru XT. We're going to sand it down. We're going to paint it with the same color as our current Subaru, get her waxed up, and get her on the vehicle. Welcome to Garb Car Garage. So we're going to start with some 400 grit sandpaper on an orbital sander, and what we're going to do is take this over the entire hood and try and sand out as much of the clear and base coat of paint as possible without digging too deep into it. So we don't need to put heavy pressure on it, just a little bit of light pressure, letting the orbital do its work, going over the entire hood and getting that top layer of paint off of it. We're going to move up to a 600 grit sandpaper. The finer sandpaper will allow us to make a smoother finish as we're continuing sanding the HUD. We're going to get this back on the orbiter. We're going to get sanding this thing down and keep smoothing out this paint surface. I'm going to get the air blower, blow off as much of the excess dust as possible, and move on to the next grit of sandpaper. So next we're going to move on to an 800 grit, get that on the orbiter, and this finer grit, again, will get us to continue to smooth down the hood, allowing us to lay some really nice smooth coats of paint. The last grit of sandpaper we're going to be using is a 1500, which is an extremely fine grit, and this will allow us to put this surface as smooth as absolutely possible before we go on to any of the refinishing, before we do some spot touch-ups. So the final step before primer, we've got some spotting putty, and what this is going to allow us to do is fill in any of the stone chips, deep scratches, or any of the imperfections that are present in the paint before we get on the primer. Once we get the primer on, all these little imperfections will be extremely visible. So we just want to get a little bit of, it's kind of like a finishing Bondo. We want to get this into the cracks, into the chips, get it smoothed out. We're going to let this sit and dry for 24 hours, and we'll get some light sandpaper and sand this smooth with the rest of the hood. So we've let the hood sit for 24 hours. The spotting putty is now dry. And what we're going to do is get a small piece of sandpaper and by hand go over each one of these spots and sand them smooth with the rest of the HUD. We don't need to use the orbital sander here as we're only dealing with small spots, and this is not an extremely tough substance to get into like a reinforced Bondo. It's basically just for crack fill. We're going to blow out the excess dust again, make sure we've got a nice clean surface to work from. Now we're going to wash the remainder of the hood to get it prepped and ready for paint. We want to make sure there's no dust or debris sitting there before we hit it with the primer. So the hood is all cleaned and good to go. So we're going to use a scratch filling primer. And for the first coat, we're going to apply nice, light, even coats to make sure we're getting good coverage, but not putting it on too heavy in any area. This will allow for proper primer adhesion. We're going to let 15 minutes elapse between coats, and for the second coat, we're going to want to put it on a little bit heavier to make sure that we've got complete coverage over the entire hood. Now, sometimes it does require a third, but in this situation, 2 is enough to get it completely covered up and ready for that coat of paint. Primer's been drying for 24 hours. We've got good even coverage across the entire face of the hood. So our next step is we're going to want to remove any of the high spots or excess paint that's dropped. We're going to use some 600 grit sandpaper. We're going to basically give this primer a light coat, not to take a lot off of it, just enough to make sure we've got a nice, even, smooth surface to work with. So when we lay our coats of paint, they do lay and apply evenly to the entire surface. Going to want to wash it down, dry it down, and get it ready for the first coat of paint. We've got our color match paint, again from robertspaintcare.com. This is a direct match to the color that we've got on the Subaru, Sage Green Metallic. And we're going to start by applying, same as a primer, light, even coats. Not looking for complete maximum coverage, but we do want to lay down a nice base layer of paint so the remaining layers will adhere to it. First layer is laid down and dried. We're about 15 minutes in. You can see it's a little bit splotchy, but we do have pretty even coverage. Not a lot of high spots or low spots. Starting to look pretty good. Second coat, we're going to want to put on just a little bit thicker. This is where we're going to want to start to develop the paint build up to make sure that we've got good even coverage across the hood. This time we're going to want to make sure that there aren't any splotches and that everything is looking nice and clean. Third coat again, we're going to go on pretty heavy. We want it to have a nice kind of almost like a wet look to it. Make sure the paint's built up and that we don't have any spots that are too thin, too low, or basically without good coverage on it. We've got pretty even coverage across the whole hood. Now it does look a little bit splotchy. That's because the different layers of paint will dry at different times. So this is good enough. We're going to let 30 minutes elapse. Then we're going to get the clear coat on here and move on. Clear coat's pretty much going to follow the same procedures as we did with the base coats of paint. Get the can shaken up nicely. Get one coat of a nice light application and make sure we got a good adhesion. And then we'll move on to a second coat. Second coat will be similar to what we did with the second and third coats of the actual paint. We're going to put this on a little bit heavier, hoping for nice, good adhesion. We want it to go on a little bit wet. That way it will dry nice and even. Okay, we've allowed for almost 48 hours to elapse. The hood is nice and dry. You can see we've got some good coverage on it. Still not exactly even across the entire amount of paint. So what we want to do next is move on to the wet sanding portion of getting this hood painted. Now we've got some different grits of very high grit sandpaper soaking in a bucket of warm water. So we're going to start with a 1500 grit. We are going to wrap it in a sponge, and what this will allow us to do is put nice even coverage without putting too much force in one spot. And we're going to wet sand the entire hood with various different grades. So 1500 will be first. We'll make sure we're going over the entire hood evenly. If there's any rough spots, working them a little bit harder. Next, we've got 2000 grit sandpaper. We'll got the 2000 grit wrapped in the same sponge. Again, we'll be wet sanding the entire hood to make sure that we've got nice even coverage. So when the wax sits on it, it sits nice and even. We get a really good shine out of it. Next, we're moving on to a 2500 grit. Same application as all the other ones. Wrap it in a sponge and give it light pressure to remove any of the high spots and create a nice smooth surface for the wax to lay. Now we're going to move on to our final wet sanding grit, which is 3000, and we'll go over the hood one final time before we get it ready to apply some wax to it and make it shine. Wet sanding is complete. We're going to wipe all the water and bubbles off and get ready for the wax. We're going to get a good quality wax on the orbital buffer, and what this is going to do is fill in any of the remaining imperfections and give this hood a really nice shine once we've got it all buffed out. Now the key to this is making sure you don't stick too long on one specific spot, because you can burn out the clear and burn the paint right back down to the base. So we got some nice good coverage on it. The wax went on very nicely. We got a really nice shine on this thing. I can't wait to see how this thing looks in the sunlight. And there it is. Beautiful. We've got really good even coverage across it, a nice shine across the entire surface of the hood. Now, would this have looked better if it was done by a professional painter at a body shop? Yes. But we've got about 130 bucks in rattle cans into it, and it looks as good as it can for that. So we want to get this on the vehicle now. We're going to get the hood open, remove the old hood off the Subaru. Last step we have is to get the hood on. I'm just hoping that the paint matches because we aren't doing any sort of blending. So we got the hood bolted on. Let's get her closed up. Boom. Looks like it belongs 100% on that vehicle. I couldn't be any happier with how this turned out. Is it as good as professional? No. But it is close for a budget. So I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to watch me today. All the music you hear in the background is a DJ Smokey exclusive. Remember to like, subscribe, and if you got any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. I try and get back to everyone. We'll see you in another couple weeks for the next video.